Welcome back to Flood Car Friday. Today's victim is a 2008 Pontiac G8 GT. It's got the 6.0 in it. Now, the victim was found unresponsive, so I don't have a lot of answers for your questions. I don't know how many miles are on it. I don't know what's wrong with it. I know it doesn't run, and worst of all, someone's been here before. So let's see if we can get some answers to our questions. See if it runs. First red flag, this alternator doesn't belong up here. It belongs down on the bottom. There should actually be a power steering pump up here. Oh, I guess we don't need it. Start by hooking up the battery cables they left disconnected. See if we get some power inside the car, at least to find out how many miles are on it. Torque it down to manufacturer's specs. And we'll find the rest of this wiring harness. We'll run this over to the fuse box. And we're missing something important, like a PCM. Floodwaters must have washed that away. The battery is still disconnected, so we're not going to have any fires here in case there's other wires not connected. But we'll get a start, and we'll check everything. Pull the air filter housing off. Pull the intake tube and everything off. All is in assembly. Disconnect the mass airflow sensor. It likes it on there. Now, first thing I would normally do is check the oil on a flood motor, but there's no oil dipstick, so that's a little difficult. So once we get this air tube off, we can see if there's anything inside the throttle body. No air filter. Must be one of those Bluetooth ones. Throttle body looks clear. Don't see any standing water in there. It's not uncommon to be missing an air filter. Usually they're soaking wet when they suck up water, and that's the first thing you toss out when you're trying to get it running. We're going to try and turn this engine over. We are doing it by hand, so let's pull the plugs out and see if we find any water in there. Luckily, these are really easy to get to. We'll pull all the spark plug wires off. At least there's no dipstick in our way over here. A little more room. Bonus. We'll break our plugs loose. They're not rusted in there. That's a good sign. I always have a lot of comments of people complaining about the tools I use. So, since you didn't like Harbor Freight, I found like something even worse. It's like antique flea market brand, but you know what? It gets the job done. If you need special tools to do your job, guess that means I'm just better than you. That ought to trigger some haters' tears. So that plug was a little rusty, but not wet. Pull the next one out. I would use an air ratchet on the plugs, but we're down at the storage yard. That's why we're wearing gloves. Because I got to get back in my truck and I don't want to get it all dirty. So I can leave the dirt on the gloves and not on my steering wheel. That one's a little rusty. A couple drops of water in it, not too bad. Pull the next one out. That one's wet. Some water in that cylinder too. How much, I don't know. Sometimes when you pull the plugs out, water will pour out. Haven't found any of those yet. And back here is the worst one to get to. And even that isn't that bad. These cars are actually pretty easy to work on. Nope, that one was dry. A little rusty, but dry. So now we'll head over to the driver's side and unscrew the air box that's finger tight. Get it out of our way. Oh, we got plenty of room for activities in there. We're going to have to remove the spark plug wires. These are Bluetooth. Again, more parts that got washed away in the flood. Break them all loose. Oh, we had one spark plug wire. We'll pull that off of there. I think Scott's G8 Emporium might have some leftovers laying around. We can throw on there. If somebody had the plugs out, they might not have put the wires back in. I might be doing work that somebody has already done. I don't know. We're on an adventure. So that plug was a little rusty, but dry. That one's pretty wet. Another rusty one. And some sensors that are unplugged. That bracket, that alternator, and that power steering pump. That's a truck bracket. So now we'll try spinning the motor over. We'll go backwards first, and we're either going to break it loose or loosen up the crankshaft bolt. Got a little water out of, looks like cylinder 3 there. So now we're going to start going the other way. Sometimes going backwards will get it freed up, because a little bit of rust builds up on top of the pistons on the cylinder walls, and it won't allow the ring to slide past it. So if you back it up a little bit, you can break it past that little initial bit of rust. And it's not the kind of rust that you really need to hone it out for or anything. Just a couple revolutions, the engine will take it off, unless it's been sitting for a long time. And then you might actually have to do some internal motor work. So we'll keep spinning it over. Once we broke it loose, it spins pretty free. We got our breaker bar on there, so it's either going to spin or bend something. But we're going to get movement of some sort. I'm pretty optimistic. We'll get rid of the breaker bar and keep going by hand. And my arms are tired, so we're going back to the breaker bar. Just going to spin it over a couple times. I did mark the crankshaft, so when I see that mark come around again, we'll do it a couple times. Make sure everything is free, nothing's binding up. The more you spin it, easier it gets. Each time we're pushing a little more of that water out of the cylinders. Once it's free, you can actually use the starter to crank it over. But that leads us to another problem. We'll get there eventually. I think it's enough to call it good. We're going to throw the plugs back in. Yes, the rusty ones, because I'm not buying a new set of plugs for an engine that I'm not even sure if it's any good. It should start with the rusty plugs. So there's all the water that we pushed out. There's quite a bit. A little rusty, not too bad. But that'll keep it from turning over, so. There was definitely water in the engine. Not sure why. Now we're back at the shop. We'll change the oil on it. Push it off the trailer. The drive shaft seems to be making some noise. We'll take our belt off of here. And now we can pull off our bracket that doesn't belong there. Since it doesn't belong there, our wiring harness won't exactly reach everything it needs to reach. So you can't plug in some important sensors like the cam sensor. Somebody had the wrong bolt in there. So if we're going to get it started, we need to plug in a few of those sensors. We're just going to set the alternator out of the way. Then we'll pull this bracket off. That's not a truck intake. Interesting, that has a truck bracket. Pull our bracket out of here. Of course, our power steering lines are snagging on everything. And the hood wanted to come play. We need to move our prop rod over. That's a snap-on prop rod. I better get it warrantied since it failed. So they zip-tied the power steering line onto the other power steering line. I don't mean they connected it, I mean they just zip-tied one to the other. I've parted out enough GM trucks to know that that power steering line and pump came from a two-wheel drive 1500. Unplug our sensors here. There's a little sub harness. We're not going to need it. Another red flag. Somehow the story I got with this car is looking less and less like the real story. Our alternator plug and stuff can just stay unplugged. We don't need it. So now we'll drop the oil out of it and see what's in there. If anyone's guessed what I'm going to find in here, it'll be water, The oil. Could be nothing. Oil. Probably the one thing we're not going to find. So I'm expecting water, and since water is heavier than oil, it comes out first. So I put a drain pan in there just to catch the water. And when you start getting more than water, you just switch over and dump the oil. A bit of water. In our regular oil caddy. That way you don't end up with a bunch of contaminated oil. A little bit of oil. Grab our oil filter wrench, spin this oil filter off. This oil change was definitely done at Jiffy Lube, as they cranked that thing on there. Well, it's full of oil. I think it's oil. It's oil-ish. Throw a new filter on there. And we'll throw our new PCM in there. These things are pretty cheap. They fit just about every LS engine. You just have it programmed to whatever car you're putting it in. So we'll snap them in there. And we'll dump our oil back in. We're just going to throw 6 quarts in it and hope that's about right, because we don't have a dipstick to check it. I'm not buying one either. We got to make sure it runs before we start spending any money on this engine. We're also going to need a water pump. That is not the right water pump on this car. And we're missing our 710 cap. Seems to be a theme lately. We'll check our imaginary dipstick. Perfect. So after I replaced the PCM, it still wouldn't crank. I found a couple fuses that were moved around and missing, and a couple relays. So I put all those in there, so we're going to give it a shot. It actually got brought up here to the south branch of Scott's G8 Emporium because, well, things got a little busy, and this is no rush, so it's just been sitting here for a few months. Yeah, I didn't just put on a hoodie. Although Chicago weather can go from 80 to snowing in one day, 1 hour. There goes nothing. Maybe actually nothing. Well, I actually wasn't expecting it. It sounds pretty good. I can't let it run too long because, well, the radiator's not hooked up along with a lot of other things. So, I have a good engine. Just so happens, it's not a 6-liter. So, something fishy's been going on here. That's actually a 5.3 truck engine. explains the bracket and the power steering pump. I'll let you guys be the judge. Was it a flood or was it fraud? Or was it a little bit of both? Because we did have water in the engine. I assume it was probably a junkyard engine sitting somewhere and maybe outside and just got water in it. Maybe they wanted to, I don't know, really put some effort into their story and just dump some water in the intake. I don't know. Couldn't tell you. All I can tell you is that's not a 6-liter. This isn't a truck. So things don't belong where they are. But it does run. And just because she runs doesn't mean I'm going to fix her. It's not really a nice car. This is actually how I got it. Of course, there were some parts in a bag. That bag, actually. And there's some more parts next to the car I took out to see what was in here. Looks like I have most of the interior. But, yeah, someone's been here before. That was a red door at one time. I would assume they took the interior out to get the stereo out, because we're missing the speakers and the radio. And there's a lot of aftermarket wiring in there. So it's not a nice car. I won't feel bad about cutting it up, especially since it has a certificate of destruction. So, kind of do like those wheels. I might have to get them powder coated and put them on something else. But it is a rust-free, clean car. I'll give it that much. Now, sometimes insurance companies will let you take parts off the car if you replace them. They take the value off what they pay you out. So if you have aftermarket accessories like a radio or something like that, they'll take off $100 or a couple $100 and let you swap the radio back out. That's pretty normal. Maybe that's where the PCM went, but that's not where the engine went, because if there was an engine in this car and it was the 6-liter and it was underwater, chances are the engine isn't going to be good. Why are they taking it out? And if they are taking it out and it is good, why did they total it? Your guess is as good as mine. But I can tell you for one fact, they were not driving it around like this, because this car is missing a couple converters. Actually, 3 of them. 2 catalytic converters and a torque converter, which means it's not going anywhere even though it runs. The drive shaft isn't hooked up, which I assume they had the trans out and then they couldn't get the engine in there and just took the torque converter out so it fit together real easy. I don't know. The radiator isn't hooked up. Power steering lines aren't hooked up. They literally were just zip tied to the other line. They definitely weren't driving it like this. And I do have the owner's information, so I'm going to give him a call and see if he'll talk to me or won't talk to me, or what kind of story I get. It'd be interesting if I got the truth. That's the one thing I don't think I'll get. But I do have a running 5.3, which I didn't plan on, because when you buy a flood car, you just assume the engine's probably bad. Figure that wiring harnesses and everything else are probably bad as well. I don't use any of that stuff on a flood car, except for my own flood car that also happened to be a G8. I guess I just end up with all the G8 flood cars. I don't know. But that one's still going good. It wasn't that deep in the water, and when it's a GXP, it's worth the gamble. So this one, just a GT, make a good parts car for the other few cars I need to use the parts for. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. So there's our missing catalytic converters. We're missing some O2 sensors too. There's our drive shaft that's not bolted up. Kind of makes a clanking sound when it's rolling. Back behind that flywheel, there should be a torque converter. That's nowhere to be found. I also had to throw a starter in there. Luckily, Scott's GM Truck Emporium had one in stock, so I threw that in there. That's what got it running. And our trans cooler lines aren't hooked up, but we don't have to worry about those leaking since the trans is not actually hooked up to the engine. Modern problems require modern solutions.